We're humans, not computers. So it's natural that our emotions play a giant role in our lives. This is certainly the case as we interact with other humans, because emotion allows us the opportunity to share compassion, sympathy, joy, and trust, to name a few. There are times, however, that would benefit from not allowing our emotions to play such a large role. An example might be a student taking a test, or a basketball player shooting an important free throw, or especially a doctor performing surgery. Another example is an investor who's making important investment decisions with the goal to increase or preserve capital and not to lose it. In the investment world, leaving your emotions out of it might be beneficial because with human emotion also comes human cognitive biases. A cognitive bias is a systematic error in our thinking that ultimately affects our decisions and judgments. However, let's leave the rest of that conversation to the psychologists. For our purposes, we're simply going to identify how investor biases can get in the way of sound financial decisions and potentially cost investors in the long run. Meet George. George is your average investor who aims to make smart investment decisions. George catches a glimpse of the news one Friday evening and sees that the market has dropped 10%. Although he's not super familiar with the fundamentals of what has occurred, he's seen enough to be concerned. Here is where we run into our first bias, the projection bias. The projection bias is the tendency for people to assume that whatever is happening in the current moment will continue happening in the future. Because of this bias, the typical reaction is that those without sound financial advice will more often than not react to this news by getting out of the market. They do this because they're projecting. Because the market dropped 10% today, they think it will surely drop again tomorrow, and so on, even when there's no fundamental analysis to back it up. Now, it's because of the projection bias that George runs into our next flawed bias, the action bias. The action bias is the belief that doing something is better than doing nothing. Meaning, when change occurs, investors believe that they need to do something, i.e. sell, buy, reallocate, flee for less risky investments, etc., rather than doing nothing, even if refraining from taking action is in their best interest. In this situation, and because of George's projections bias that the next shoe is going to drop, coupled with the action bias that George needs to do something in response to the market decline, he gets on his computer and sells a large portion of his equity funds and turns around and reallocates into the bond market. This brings us to our third bias, the herding bias. When an investor is witness to people all exhibiting similar investment behavior, the herding bias can often influence them to feel left behind if they aren't doing the same thing. It's Saturday, and George attends a barbecue with friends. He and a small group are discussing the recent market decline, and George, along with another gentleman, mentioned that they couldn't stand a market correction, and they got out. Later that day, on the drive home, George's friends, who were involved in the prior discussion, begin thinking, "Boy, I'd hate to lose my money. George and Dan are right. I can't sit back and watch my portfolio get crushed." Because of the herding bias, friends of George, who also have no fundamental basis for making the investment decisions they're about to make, feel that they'll be left behind if they don't act in a similar fashion as the herd, so they sell out of the market. Monday comes around, and instead of the market continuing its projected crash course, it rebounds, plus an additional 5%. The downturn on Friday was the result of a missed earnings report of a giant blue-chip stock, which created an overreaction within the market. Investors and analysts over the weekend had time to dig a little deeper and recognize that the fundamentals within this giant blue-chip company were still very much intact, and the missed earnings were not expected to be a long-term issue. This created a buying opportunity and a nice rebound plus some on Monday morning. George, Dan, and their friends, based on cognitive biases, cost themselves the 10% from Friday's decline and the 15% rebound on Monday, 10% back to par and another 5% on top of it. Whoa, bummer, right? You might be thinking, these biases might affect George, but I'm smarter than that. I wouldn't do that. Well, we've got one more bias for you, and that's called the bias blind spot. The bias blind spot is defined as the inability to recognize that we suffer from the same cognitive distortions that often plague other people. So, before we judge George and other investors like him, it would be wise for us to recognize that we too are subject to these biases. So ultimately, what's an investor to do? As with all financial-related topics, we strongly suggest that you work closely with a financial professional who can help guide you through the market's ups and downs through proper diversification. An added benefit is that they can help take some of the emotion and cognitive biases out of the decision-making process. Stay tuned as we continue to explore additional concepts.